Airplanes don't fly over Tibet. Here's why. Airplanes can travel for thousands of kilometers across the world. Rockets have landed men on the moon, and Elon Musk wants to land men on Mars within the next couple years. The world has been made so small by us that it's easy to overlook some of the forgotten parts. Airplanes are traveling through the skies pretty much everywhere on Earth at all times. But if you were to open up a live global air traffic map right now and pan over to Asia, you'll see nothing over this massive area of the continent. It always appears that all of the world's airplanes are simply avoiding this huge area and going out of their way to fly around it. Like it's some kind of forbidden zone to travel over or fly through. This isn't the middle of the ocean, this is a huge area of land directly over Asia, the world's most heavily populated continent. So why is this happening? The dead zone in question is over a geographic region known as the Tibetan Plateau, and it's one of the world's biggest wastelands after Antarctica and northern Greenland. The Tibetan Plateau is the least hospitable place for humans to live in the entire world and is the most sparsely populated. It's an area that's over 5 times larger than France, but only has a population of a little over 14 million people. Few people live here because the plateau's average elevation is over 4,500 meters tall, making the Tibetan Plateau the highest geographic region in the world and earning it the nickname the Roof of the World. The nickname is aptly deserved because the Roof of the World has been one of the world's biggest obstacles to aviation for decades. The first large-scale attempt to fly across the plateau was during the World War II, when the Allies in what was then British India needed to airlift supplies into China to assist them in the fight against the Japanese. The distance from India to China was just 840 kilometers, but because they were flying over the remote mountains and high steppes of the Tibetan Plateau, the pilots faced extremely violent turbulence, wind speeds up to 200 miles per hour, temperatures cold enough to freeze their fuel, inclement weather events that were difficult to predict, and almost no emergency airports that they could divert to in the event of an accident. All of these hazards added up to an incredibly lethal flight path that over the time span of 42 months saw 594 planes and 1,659 men who were lost in the mountains, never to be seen again. The vast majority of these losses were a simple result of the threatening elements the pilots were flying through and not a result of enemy action. The loss in life for the Allied air crews here was even higher than during the entire Battle of Britain against the Germans. 50% of all Allied planes that flew the route were crashing, which would obviously not exactly be an acceptable loss rate to a modern airliner. For the modern airliners, the Tibetan Plateau has been gradually opened up in the decades since the World War II. The first airport in Chinese Tibet was built in 1956, and the modern airport in the Tibetan capital Lhasa was built a decade later in 1965. Today there are 2 significant international airports located on the Tibetan Plateau in Lhasa and Jining. Both of these airports primarily handle domestic air travel to and from the rest of China. Sometimes planes are flying over the Tibetan Plateau in modern times, but almost every international flight between Eastern Asia and the West will go out of their way to avoid flying over it. Despite the existence of modern international airports and being able to actually fly over the mountains, it ultimately comes down to 4 primary reasons. The average elevation of the Tibetan Plateau is well over 14,000 feet, and airliners usually cruise at over 30,000 feet normally, but under certain critical emergency situations like a cabin depressurization or engine failure event, airline protocol is to descend down to 10,000 feet. In a cabin depressurization scenario, the plane will drop oxygen mask for passengers to breathe, but there's only a limited supply, generally only around 20 minutes. This is intended to be enough time for the passengers to last breathing on while the plane descends down to 10,000 feet, where normal breathing conditions can be resumed. This isn't possible anywhere over the vast Tibetan Plateau, because the average elevation is over 14,000 feet, meaning that if a plane descended down to 10,000 feet as protocol demands, It would almost certainly crash into the side of a mountain and everyone would pass away if a cabin depressurization happens over Tibet. The second reason is there's just nobody that really lives there, so there isn't really a very big demand. Long-haul international flights between Europe and Asia will avoid flying over Tibet because they don't want to risk having an emergency situation while flying over it. But there aren't that many shorter domestic flights either because there's just so few people there. The Tibet Autonomous Region in China has just a little over 3 million people who live across the entire massive area, meaning that despite Tibet taking up almost 13% of China's total land, it only accounts for 0.2% of China's total population. The reasons why long-haul flights avoid flying over Tibet are bad turbulence and the risk of jet fuel freezing. When fast winds move across the plateau and the mountains, the wind will often take a wave-shaped pattern. When airplanes fly through this wind pattern, the turbulence can get extremely bumpy, which can further complicate any emergency scenarios. And finally, there's the problem of jet fuel. Theoretically, jet fuel freezes when the temperature gets below -40°C, and while extremely cold conditions like that rarely take place anywhere the jets fly, the temperatures in the air above the already high and cold Tibetan plateau can get to that point or worse. This isn't really a problem for a short flight through, but for longer flights across the plateau that might last for 6 hours or more. The big reason why airplanes almost always avoid flying over the Tibetan plateau to get to their destinations isn't because of any supernatural curse or something like that, but a simple reality that if they were to experience an emergency while flying across, it would perhaps be the most lethal place anywhere over the inhabited Earth's continents.